The Walther P5 is a chip off the old block, literally, because it uses the same locking block mechanism as its predecessor, the venerable Walther P38. But how are these block brothers different? How are they alike? And what does that mean for your life as a gun hipster? And on today's edition of Hipster Head to Head, that's what we're going to discuss. All right, Walther P5 versus P38. And I think this is going to be an interesting one because I haven't seen too much in the way of like a direct comparison between these two guns. And, you know, those of us who know guns, we know that the P5 is obviously related and based on the Walther P38. And I think, you know, we tend to see the P5 as a heavily upgraded P38. And while I don't think that's wrong per se, that it is somewhat true, I was really surprised how different these guns handle, how different they feel, how differently they shoot, and just a very different experience overall. You know, I own the P5 first, and I do have a review on this P5 that I did last year. It was when I was still doing my videos on my webcam, so the quality isn't great, but the content's still decent. When I started shooting this, I got this a few months ago, I expected something more in line with the feel and everything that I get with this. And, you know, I feel like there's some parallels between this and the Beretta 92, because the Beretta 92 also uses the locking block design. But the P38 really surprised me that it doesn't really feel a lot like, in my opinion, a lot like the P5 and the Beretta 92. I don't want to get too much into the history of these guns in this video. I want to focus on, you know, just how they're different and how, you know, both mechanically and just in terms of how they shoot and how they feel and how they are. But, you know, if you don't know, the P38 unofficially replaced the P08 Luger as the standard issue sidearm of the German army right before World War II. After the war, they stopped making them for a while. In the 50s, they started making them again, started using alloy frames, and they made these in one form or another up until like the 80s or 90s, and these stayed in service with the German military, the post-war German military, the Bundeswehr, up until about 2004. And in 1963, they started designating the P38s that were used in military service as the P1. So sometimes you'll hear people talk about the P1 versus the P38. They're all P38s, even later commercial P38s, you know, after the P1 switch, those were still marked P38. And then in the 70s, you know, after the Munich terrorist situation in Germany, I guess it was 1972, Germany wanted new police pistols. The big German gun manufacturers, Walther, Sig Sauer, Mauser, and Heckler & Koch, they all submitted designs for new police pistols. The P5 was what Walther submitted. Again, it uses pretty much the same system as the Walther P38, but as we'll see when we look into the mechanics of these guns, there's a lot that's different. And I want to get into that part of it, the mechanical differences in the P5 versus the P38, because I think it gives us some context to understand why these guns handle and shoot so differently, at least in my experience. So with that, let's head on over to the Hipster Tactical technical table. All right, guys, welcome to the Hipster Tactical technical table. and it is a table, not a bench. I've got these guns apart. The takedown, process is pretty much the same, though you do have to decock the hammer before you take the slide off on the P38, which you don't on the P5. So that's interesting. But let's start with, how these guns are similar before we start talking about the differences, which, as I've found, are more different than I thought they were. But again, they are, based on the same design. So looking at the frame, you can see the layout is very similar. They've got the recoil springs, the dual recoil springs in the back are in the same place, and trying to keep this in frame so you can see it, but you see the recoil springs run on these channels here in the back. Same there. The the magazine well is pretty much the same. The dimensions of that is all the same. The feed ramps are pretty much the same, though the feed ramp on the P5 goes down a little bit further. My guess is that just was to improve feeding with a wider range of bullet designs. And this P5 has been shot more than this P38, so you see more finish loss on the aluminum alloy feed ramp. And then, the front ahead of the feed ramp, it's got this channel kind of in the middle, and they both have that. And the key mechanics in the slides, similar there. You see these recesses here. Those are pretty much the same in both guns, and that's what the upward facing hooks on the locking blocks, that's what they hook into, and that's what locks the barrel and trunnion to the slide. You see these little nubs here in both, and that's what pushes the recoil springs back. So when you put the slide on the frame, the recoil springs kind of get captured behind those things, and that's what buffers the slide with the two recoil springs. So that's all the same too, but we see the main difference being that the P5 slide extends further ahead. That change dictates a lot of what's different in terms of the locking block and the frame and how everything fits together, as we'll see. Looking at the locking blocks themselves, you start to see some pretty significant differences. I guess you call this rear part a trunnion. My understanding of the usage of the term trunnion is somewhat speculative and limited, but I think a trunnion is kind of where the barrel attaches to the frame, so I'm going to refer to all this rear machinery on the barrels as the trunnion. So you see the trunnion assembly on the P38 is just more squared off and robust, and a lot of it has been machined away on the P5. There's this sort of internal set of tracks that the trunnion rides on in the P38, and that's not coming out. There's little ledges here, little rails that fits on, and that's pretty tight in there. That's very tight. Whereas in the P5, it just kind of sits in there. Like there's nothing holding it in or capturing it in there. But again, we see how much more support this thing is getting out front to hold it in place. And I'm guessing that they kind of machined a lot of this bulk away just because they needed room for the slide to kind of enshroud the front part of this. Maybe they needed more strength in the back on the P38 because this part was the only thing holding the barrel trunnion assembly to the frame. Another interesting thing is this part back here. This is the part that it glides over this stepped area on the frame, and when the gun returns to battery, this is what pushes the wedge up into full lockup within the slide, and you can see the P38 frame right there. And the angle is slightly different. Like this angle here, this slope, it's almost like two angles here, two facets on the P5, where it's just a kind of one angle here on the P38. So that's interesting. And I don't know if that affects the timing of the lockup. It may. I find that the P5 just cycles a little smoother and the recoil impulse is a little smoother, so maybe it kind of breaks up the pivoting of the wedge a little bit with these kind of two facets. I don't know, that's just a hypothesis, but that is one difference. And if you know anything about these guns, you know that the P5 has this hex bolt that passes through the frame, And that is, so that part we just talked about, that has a solid steel surface to bang against, basically, to bear against. And you can see how much wear there is happening on the P38s, just bare aluminum here. And that's why they added this, because that part of the frame takes a lot of punishment as the block is camming up and down. On the later P38s and P1s, they did add this hex bolt. So when they went to the P5 in the 70s, the mid 70s, they carried this over from the later P1s and P38s. Another interesting thing is, if you know about P38s and P1s, they went to a fatter slide. I think like in the early 70s, late 60s, early 70s, they made that transition. And this is a 1960 P38, so it has the thinner slide, which is, the same thickness that they used on the P38s in World War II. And what's interesting is the P5, I just kind of assumed, since they had gone to the thicker slides on the P1s and everything, before they even made the P5, I figured the P5 would have that thicker slide, and it doesn't. These are almost exactly the same width. So that's kind of interesting. I guess with the added mass of the slide in the front, maybe they didn't think they needed the added mass of the thicker slide. So they went back to, I think, a slightly thinner slide on the P5 than they had been making on the fat slide P1s and P38s. So another thing that's interesting, and I think most of you know, that the Beretta 92 uses a locking block design just like the Walthers. And but what's interesting is that the Beretta system was designed in between the P38 and the P5. So in a way, I started wondering, were there kind of transitional elements that showed up in the Beretta design that carried over into the P5, since that was designed between the P38 and the P5. And I guess to be specific, Beretta's take on the system showed up in the 1951, and that was their first locking block design pistol, and that system evolved into what we see in the 92. This is the barrel and trunnion and locking block of my 1989 Beretta 92F, but I think it's interesting that on the P38, you see the block is again just kind of broad, and just the full length is just squared off, and it needs this little spring to kind of retain it. But then Beretta, I think, kind of figured out how to simplify it, and it just kind of fits into this little recess in this lug down here. And then, Walther's doing pretty much the same thing on the P5, and it's a similar design. Now it's a little beefier on the P5 because Beretta's take on this design was that this was a replaceable part, and it would have a finite service life, and you just replace it, keep shooting the gun, you'd be good to go. But I think it's interesting that we kind of see that design on the P5, and also Beretta kind of thinned out the locking block so it's not as wide as we see in the P38, and obviously we're seeing that same thing on the P5, and I guess that's because both the 92 and the P5 had the fully enclosed slides. There probably needed to be more machined away so everything could kind of fit together, and again, they didn't need that on the P38 because it's got that exposed barrel. Another thing I figured I'd mention, if you look at the contour that leads up from the nub that cams the locking block up and down, the contour is similar on the P5 and the Beretta 92. It has that more swoopy, concave contour, and I'm guessing that's a function of how it pivots and how it fits into that central lug on both the P5 and the Beretta, because it fits in a similar way. I'm guessing they had to kind of thin that part out and give it a different contour to fit correctly, where is again, because the P38 uses the spring, it's got to have a slightly different shape. But I'm not sure that it has any effect on how it cams, how it cycles, but it seems to me that's another kind of cue that Walther took from Beretta with the P5. And of course, there are some just like superficial differences that don't really impact how the guns cycle necessarily. The big one being the lever setup. That's different. On the P5, you have this dual purpose lever. But you see they basically took the same lever from the P38 and just added a new lever on top of it. And you know, when you push this down, first it just pulls the slide stop lever out of its notch, and then you kind of push it down again and it'll decock. So that's interesting. Also, the firing pin safety is different on these, and you know, on the P38 you have a familiar like drum style safety. It has a lever here that pushes that up and disengages the firing pin safety, whereas the P5's is very unique. The firing pin block safety is very unique. It has this central part that comes up. You can see it kind of coming up there, and that's what lifts the firing pin up, you know, from its bottom position. You can see it kind of moving up there, and that's what lifts it into alignment with the hammer, so every time you pull the trigger and it can actually fire. So that's a very unique system, and you see that kind of trough here in this part, this central part, and that's where that little lever rides. And then you have a kind of fixed solid ejector in the P5, and it's more of a flippy little lever thing. Comes up here in the P38, and you do have to push these down when you reassemble the P38. So that's interesting. And there are some ergonomic differences which, while subtle, as we'll get into, I feel like really make a difference in how these guns handle and how they shoot. Also, the extractors are different on these guns. The P38s is just kind of a solid piece of metal, whereas they added these kind of cutouts here. I don't know how well you can see that, but they kind of thinned out the central part of the extractor here on the P5's extractor. And that's something I've seen on other guns. My FN HPDA has an extractor very similar to this, and I guess they add that space in there so crud doesn't get compacted in there and makes it move easier. Not 100% sure, but that's my best guess onto why that design is used on some modern extractors. All right, so clearly a lot went into the redesign of the P5, you know, from the P38. And I think that's an important point of distinction. The P5 is a redesign. Clearly it's based on the P38, but it's a different gun. And the first thing you notice is obviously the slide. The slide obviously encloses the barrel. It's not just a superficial difference. It really, I think, impacts how the gun feels when it cycles. This P38 is the only gun I've ever shot that has an exposed barrel like this, and really there aren't any other semi-automatics that have an exposed barrel like this, except the Luger. I haven't shot a Luger. But the recoil impulse, and I talked about this in my P5 review and in my Beretta 92 review. To me, the recoil cycle on the P5 and the Beretta 92, they have a similar character. They have this uniquely communicative feel, and you just get this feedback that kind of informs your shot placement. And I feel like both of these guns are very easy to shoot accurately, and they have this this feel that's just very intuitive. And I don't experience that on the P38 really at all. That kind of slower, more relaxed recoil impulse, it's just, you don't get that on this. And I think that's because, you know, you basically got half a slide, so it's cycling faster, it's kind of whipping back. It feels less tangible. The recoil impulse just feels less tangible with this. It seems like the slide's moving a little slower. Same with the Beretta 92. In that, I just don't get the natural intuitive sense of shot placement with this gun that I do on the P5. Honestly, the recoil on this gun's uncomfortable. I was not crazy about it. Putting 100 rounds to this gun, my hand hurt, and I'll roll in a picture of what my hand looked like at the range. This thing really hammers into your hand. Again, I think it's because, you know, this half a slide is just really moving quickly, and in some ways it almost feels like a straight blowback gun in some ways. I mean, not exactly, but it has that character to it, that very snappy, abrasive feel to the recoil impulse. I found it difficult to control, and you know, my shots were kind of spilling left with this because it was just hard to lock down. You know, I will say with this P38, this is an early post-war P38, and the later post-war P38s with the thicker slide, you know, then you're getting more mass in the slide. They greatly improved the sights in the later post-war P38s. They added a dot to them, I think. This is just a simple blade, and you know, if you align the top part of the blade, your shots will go low. I started aligning in my later shooting with this gun like the bottom root of the post, and then my shots went slightly high. But I found that was, you know, truer to the desired point of impact than the top of the post. So the sights are kind of a mess on this. This gun, I didn't enjoy shooting it, I'll be completely honest. And with that said, it was 100% reliable. This gun, I put close to 400 rounds through it, give or take. I mag dumped it, and this old warhorse, it never missed a beat. It shot everything I put through it. I didn't put any hollow points through it. These guns are known to, you know, the feed ramp geometry just isn't real great with hollow points. I have heard that P5s will feed hollow points just fine, and a wider variety of bullet types. And if you look at the feed ramp does go lower on the P5, so I think that, you know, that was an upgrade they made. So, you know, it's reliable, and I think it's accurate. I think this gun is plenty accurate, and I think, as we discussed in the mechanical overview, they definitely, this gun locks up tight, the trunnion and everything, it locks up tight with the frame, so I don't think you're missing out necessarily on any accuracy with this exposed barrel. Once I got used to shooting this gun, I shot some pretty tight groups, but it was just hard to control, and I found that the stock grips over here, the factory grips, honestly, they felt better than, I think these grips are Altamont grips, but I found them on eBay. But I started out with these, and they have a nice thin feel. They feel kind of like the P5, but they did not give a lot of purchase and control. And I went to these, and honestly, they don't feel as good, but I feel like I needed the extra girth in the grip to control it better. And I found I really had to like death grip this gun to get it to control it, because again, this slide is just, it's very jolty and abrasive. It's much harder to control, I feel, than what I found on the P5, and I feel the P5 shoots significantly softer. As far as the ergonomics, the differences are subtle, and but at the end of the day, meaningful, I think, into how these guns differ in terms of how they feel. And you know, the P5 went to a straighter backstrap here, and you know, it just kind of has this nice tight angle, whereas you have more of a curve on the P38 grips. And you know, same with the factory grips. You know, these are not the factory grips, but same type of thing. And also I feel like they cut the tang here just a little bit higher, and it's not a whole lot. It's not a huge difference, but it's enough. And I don't know how well you can see that here on the camera, but you're able to just get a touch higher up on the P5, and it just feels like everything falls into place better, and the gun sits in your hand better. It points more naturally for me. The straighter angle here, it makes the trigger reach, not that the trigger reach is far, it's still a single stack. Trigger reach is just naturally kind of short on both these guns, but it's even shorter on the P5, and for someone with small hands, man, it's just great. As I mentioned before, the later P38s, you know, after they started calling them the P1, they thickened up the slide, and everything I've read, the reason for that is durability, that they were getting some cracked slides here and there, and they thickened up the slide for durability, and I'm sure that had something to do with it, but I wonder if it was for shootability too, because this it's tough to control, and I can't be the only one that feels that way. I haven't shot a P1, P38 with a fatter slide, so I can't say how different it is, but it seems like it would be different. Now, the triggers on these guns are both similar and different, and the single action isn't vastly different on them. It's a little lighter on the P5. It's the single action trigger on the P5 is just fantastic. And you know, you have a nice wall and just a really understated but crisp break, and it's very nice. And then on the P38, it's you know, you have that similar wall. The wall feels a little firmer on this, and the break is a little heavier, and there's just a slightly more creep. It's just a little less refined, but it feels similar. Now, the double action on these guns is more different. I'll say this about this P38. This double action is terrible. And if you've watched any of my other videos, I don't necessarily think trigger weight is the only metric of what determines a good double action trigger pull. But this one's so heavy, and it's not just heavy, like it sticks in the beginning. Like you have to, I'm pulling on it pretty hard, and then hammer finally breaks free from wherever it is. And maybe there's some like cosmoline down there in the action, I don't know. And then it's heavy, it's so heavy, it sticks, and it just sucks. And it's one of my least favorite double action triggers that I've experienced. But here's the odd thing. I shot this gun better in double action than I did in single action. And it takes a lot of strength. It's kind of draining to shoot this gun in double action, but you really have to squeeze it. You really have to manhandle that trigger back as you're shooting it. But I tell you what, I mean, I noticed after I did my like 50 round group in single action, which I always do, I was just kind of shooting double action at the head, and I noticed I was shooting him dead center when I was shooting him double action. So I still don't like the double action on this, but you know, as I've said before, and this is proof of that, just because a double action feels like shit or it's heavy doesn't mean it doesn't necessarily shoot well. And as far as the double action on the P5, the double action of the P5 is one of the most unique double action pulls that I've experienced. And it's weird. It's very light up to a certain point. It's super light, super smooth, and then it hits a wall. It's almost like a single action wall. And you can easily, like, I'm not like focusing on stopping the trigger before the break, on staging it like you sometimes do. Like it just stops right there. And it's weird, like, okay, I'm up against that kind of double action wall, and I can almost break it like a single action then. It's the most unique double action I've used. It's almost like, it's not quite like an LEM. If you ever shot an LEM on an H&K, it's like this kind of loose slack up to a certain point, and then it just kind of goes into a break. And that's because on the LEM, the hammer spring is kind of compressed already. That's not the case here, but it's like they made the upfront part of the pull all slack, and then you just go into a nice wall, and it's easy to shoot, and you've got this over travel stop, so even if you kind of mash the trigger a little bit, you have a margin for error. And shooting that way, taking it up to the wall and just breaking the shot, almost like a single action, I can shoot nice tight groups with this gun. It's really unique, and I don't know if they designed it that way, but I kind of think maybe they did, and because, you know, why else would it be like that? And again, the single action on the P5 is just fantastic, and I think it's all improved by this nice little over travel screw here they have on the trigger shoe. All right, kind of moving into conclusion here, I don't think it's any great mystery. I greatly prefer the P5. To me, they're so different. They're even hard to compare. And it's interesting, I find, I alluded to this before, but I find a lot more similarities between the P5 and the 92 in terms of how they handle, how they shoot, than I do with the P38 and the P5. I tend to think, and I showed you some of the design cues that kind of came from Beretta that showed up in the P5, and they're subtle, but I have to think that, you know, because Beretta's take on the locking block, that was the intermediary between the P38 and the P5. So I tend to think maybe there's more Beretta in the P5 than, you know, people tend to think. I'm not saying Walther copied Beretta's design. They clearly didn't. If anything, Beretta copied Walther's design. But I think, you know, that gun was, the 1951 was around when Walther was designing this gun. And I read that there was actually a lawsuit that Walther, you know, when Beretta came out with in 1951, Walther actually sued Beretta for taking their design. And clearly it is. They did take it from the design. Still, I don't see how it's using the locking block design. Beretta's use of the locking block design is really much different than like every other gun that used a Browning style tilt barrel. I mean, that was John Browning's idea, and just about every other gun uses it. So is it really that much different for Beretta to use the locking block design? I don't know. At the end of the day, I think it's amazing just how much, you know, with just a smart approach to redesigning what they started with the P38, how much they improved this gun. Of all the guns I own, I'm not sure there's any gun just going to the range and shooting that makes me as happy as shooting the P5. I just love shooting this gun. It's so nice. The ergonomics, I have small hands and the ergonomics just work for my hands, but it has such a nice recoil impulse. It's so pleasant to shoot, the trigger's good, and I just love this gun. I think I may own guns that might be more absolutely accurate, like the P88, the P9S, but this gun puts such a smile on my face, whereas it's totally the opposite with this gun. Of all the guns I own, I think I enjoy shooting this gun the least. And I don't want to bash this gun because it is reliable. It was definitely a pioneer, and I don't think it's inaccurate for a minute. I think it's probably as accurate as any other of these locking block guns. The gap in terms of shootability and feel that exists between the P5 and the P38 was just surprising to me. And again, I think there are other variables that were updated with the P1, P38s that probably made these better shooting guns, but this is the one you want if you know, if you're looking for one of these guns. That said, these are a lot more expensive. They're a lot more rare. You can go on Gunbroker and find P1s and P38s all day, especially with the batch of early P38s like this one that are going to have the thin slide and the shitty sights. There's tons of those on the market right now, and that, you know, again, that's what this one is. So, you know, if you can find a P5, it's in my opinion much superior than the original P38 design. But they're both cool guns, and they're both historically significant, I think. And it's cool to look at how Walther evolved that design and really perfected it, I think, with the P5. All right, thank you so much for watching. If you like hip-hop beats like the one I did in the intro, check out my SoundCloud. The link is in the description. And for lots of other cool gun content on cool guns, visit hipstertactical.com. I've got in-depth written reviews on a lot of the guns you've seen here, and links, of course, to all the videos. So, thanks again for watching. I'm Matt, and this is Hipster Tactical.